So, we are on to chapter 3 of Sansûkh. This beautiful masterpiece. It's so satisfying having a hardback book and doing that with my nails. Sorry about a couple of the incorrect Khuzdul translations at the beginning of the last one. The correct Khuzdul will always be in the description if this is on SoundCloud or YouTube. Also, sorry I keep looking like over this direction. I know that the camera is there, but I'm looking at myself in that direction, so I will try to look at the camera, but it's counterintuitive. I already recorded this once and then my phone mucked me about, so I'm recording this again, so I get to read chapter 3 again, which isn't a hardship, really. Without further ado. The days passed slowly. 2 dwarfs who had died during the Battle of the 5 Armies, as they were now calling it, bowed to Thorin upon meeting him, and at least another 6 punched him square in the face. His grandfather patted his shoulder consolingly. "You should have seen this place after Akhûnîth," was all he said. He was shown to a work area in the smithies, and though the metals were the finest and purest he had ever worked with, he did not have much heart for craft. Mithril and silver made him melancholy, and the sight of gold filled him with a self-loathing so great he could taste it in his mouth. Only copper, steel, or iron would he shape. Occasionally, Thorin would work beside him, though they spoke but little. Freyrin did not come to the forge. His brother evidently sensed that Thorin needed time after what they had seen, and left him to his own devices. When he was not in the smithy, Thorin spent time with his mother and nephews. Fili and Kili made him smile again, though it was strained. His mother comforted him as no other could, her fingers busy on her harp as she played old, peaceful songs from his childhood, untouched by any sorrow. Eventually, however, Thorin could put it off no longer, and he made his way back to the chamber of Sansûkh to dive back amongst the drowned stars. He went to his sister first. Dís still wept. He could not reach her through her mourning. He sat with her for long hours, watching her thin, grey face grow thinner and greyer, and pleaded with her to eat. She did not. He left, his heart heavy. In Erebor there was a funeral. Thorin watched as they laid the Arkenstone on his cold, dead breast, wrapped his parchment white and stiffened fingers around the hilt of Orcrist, and sealed his body and those of his nephews in the tomb. Bilbo cried bitterly the whole time. As the white stone passed over Fili's rent and rigid corpse, Thorin covered his mouth with his hands, pressing them so fiercely against his bloodless lips that he could feel the shape of his teeth beneath. With a savage curse, he closed his eyes and fled that sight. He opened them again to see a tavern in the halls of Ered Luin. There, unhappy and bemused, he watched his fiery young cousin get roaring drunk. Gimli sang and danced, drank and laughed, and sat slumped behind his tankard with his head in his hands. At one point he sent a powerful blow straight into the teeth of another Dwarrow for some slight made against his father's company. The two eventually went staggering home arm in arm, singing a bawdy marching song that the lad really should not know at his age. Compared to the hollow, wretched desolation of Erebor, Gimli seemed to burst with life, filled with youthful vigour and strength. His energy was contagious, and Thorin emerged from the star-lit waters feeling somewhat lighter. He returned to the forge and bent to his work with a renewed will. He finished a sword. It was his finest effort. Then he steeled his heart and plunged into the pool again. Dís did not weep any longer. She sat still as a stone on the chair of Ered Luin, approving baggage train after baggage train and convoy after convoy that left for Erebor. She did not sense him. Her eyes were like chips of ice in her face. Thorin begged her to hear him, but she was unreachable as the moon. Work was proceeding apace on the mountain. Everywhere he looked, Thorin could see the devastation caused by the dragon and the echoes of his folly. Even as the kingdom slowly began to rise from mourning, Thorin could barely look at his living companions without seeing the light of the gold sickness that had once danced in their eyes. No one had been as thoroughly lost as Thorin himself, of course, but he had dragged them all behind him into his madness nevertheless. To see the guilt and grief in their faces made his own grow until it felt like a stone chained around his neck. Bifur lived. Under Bofur and Bilbo's steady care, he slowly began to improve. The scar on his forehead was a hideous thing, a great dent inches deep. He did not speak at all, and even English Mek escaped him at times. Now and then he would pause in mid-motion, and the frustration in his face bordered on fury. Bomba would carry a limp for the rest of his life. He seemed resigned to it, and bent himself to the task of carving a great walking staff. It had many cunningly concealed compartments in which he kept spices, forks, sweets, and biscuits. Ori was out of his sick bed as soon as Oin gave him permission, though a racking cough continued to plague him. He immediately began to help Nori with relearning to walk. The former thief was sullen as he clattered about their rooms. With each of his arms looped over the shoulders of his brothers, he winced and cursed with every rattling step until finally he roared with anger and resentment. Ori stood his ground, all his shyness and uncertainty burned away in the fires of battle. He faced his brother's rage calmly until Nori had exhausted himself, and then helped him back to his chair. Nori made pot of tea after pot of tea, lips white and stiff, before carefully plaiting the drained and silent Nori's red-brown hair back into its elaborate braids. Then the brothers held onto Nori's hands tightly until he felt able to cry. Sorry, my phone was drifting down slowly. Anyway, carrying on. Dain quickly appointed Gloin, Oin, Balin, and Dwalin to posts of power. Balin was the seneschal and first advisor, Gloin the treasurer. Oin became a councillor, and Dwalin gained command of the army, such as it was in its reduced and pitiful state. There was some grumbling from the folk of the Iron Hills, but Dain pinned them with his gimlet stare until they were silent. When Balin's beard had nearly grown back, his company said farewell to their burglar. Bilbo was grave, and his face was drawn as he embraced them all in turn, and told them to call in on him if they were ever near the Shire. He smiled wanly. "Tea is at 4 o'clock, but any of you are welcome at any time." Oin patted the little fellow's head, and Dori pressed a bundle of embroidered and folded linens into Bilbo's hands. "What's this?" he said, and opened one before letting out a laugh. "Pocket handkerchiefs." "Well, you never know," Ori said, and ducked his head, coughing. There was a vivid red scar running along the side of his soft young face. "Travel safely," Balin said, before pulling the hobbit into another tight embrace. "You were always one of us, Bilbo Baggins, khazâd-bâhel, Dwarf-Friend. Be you well." Bilbo's chin trembled, and he clutched at Balin's coat with shaking fingers. "I wish," he said in a tiny little voice. "I know, laddie," Balin murmured. "We all do." With a sigh, Bilbo pushed himself away and straightened his little jacket and sword belt. Thorin's fingers drifted over the hobbit's features, and he wished too. Oh, how he wished. Bofa chucked him under his chin, and then took his ragged hat and dropped it on Bilbo's curly head. "Here," he said, "keep a hold of that for me. I'll be around to collect it one of these days." Bilbo gave him a watery smile and fingered the brim. "I'll do that." "Hobbit," said Dwalin, and cleared his throat loudly. "Not sure if anyone's said this to you at all." Then he bowed before the astonished hobbit and said with all sincerity, "Thank you." "Aye, thank you, laddie. We can never thank you enough." The rest of the company also bowed low. Bilbo looked upset and flustered. "No, you mustn't," he said, and he wrung his little hands. "No, please, my friends." Balin rose and winked at Bilbo. Khazâd-bâhel. "Oh, for goodness sake," Bilbo snapped, and mopped at his eyes with one of his new handkerchiefs. "Dwarves! Overdramatic, the lot of you. Oh, I'm going to miss you all dreadfully." "Bilbo," Gandalf said gently, "time to be off." He turned his head to look out over the deep purple expanse of Mirkwood and the spires of the misty mountains in the distance. "Here," he said softly, and back again. Then he turned back to the remainder of Thorin's company and wagged his finger at them. "Wish I'd never met you," he said, and gave a sad little chuckle. "You've been a thoroughly terrible influence. What will they make of me back home? Who will I be now?" "You're our burglar," said Dwalin gruffly, and several others chorused their agreement. "Any of them give you trouble, you send me a raven. I'll sort 'em out." "Where will I find a trained raven in the Shire?" Bilbo snorted. "Besides, I rather think I can handle myself nowadays. But thank you for the offer." "I'll be through in a year or two," Gloin promised. "I'll be travelling back to Ered Luin to collect my family. Bomba too. We'll stop by. Don't forget." With a leg up from Dori, Bilbo crawled astride his pony. "I'll lock up my dishes especially," he laughed. "Farewell, my friends. Write as often as you can." "Get going, lad, or we'll be out here all day," muttered Nori, his face thunderously unhappy. "Yes, quite," Bilbo mumbled, and he fidgeted for a moment with his reins. "Nasty business, this travelling. Yes, best to get it over and done with." "Kill a goblin or two for me," said Bomba. "Hope I don't get too close." Aye, and watch out for trolls, and giants, and rivers, and spiders, and elves. Send me a copy of that herb law book, if you would be so kind. That was Oin. And the recipe for that fruitcake you mentioned, Bomba added. Oh, and if you please, definitely anything you have on the history of hobbits in the Shire. That was definitely Ori. Goodbye. And with that, Bilbo turned his pony. He was still a rather atrocious rider, and began to trot away, the wizard and the bear man keeping pace. Thorin took a last look at their brave little burglar to whom he owned so much. Farewell, Bilbo Baggins, respectable gentle hobbit of Bag End, he said half to himself. Farewell, wise and kindly child of the West. He drank in the sight of the curly head, the bold, bare little chin, the small leaf-like ears, the shrewd eyes and sharp tongue, clever hands and large furry feet. I am sorry, he added, his voice nearly a whisper. Bilbo abruptly stopped and faced the mountain, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Farewell, Thorin Oakenshield, he said, his face lifting, and Fili and Kili, may your memory never fade. Thorin jerked back as though struck, and then closed his eyes hurriedly. When he blinked awake in the chamber of Sansûkh, he staggered through the pearl-studded arch and back to the dark, warm closeness of his chamber, where he would sit with his hands and eyes clenched for hours. Uncle? Fili, Thorin said, and put aside the knife he was detailing, a match for the sword. The pommel was giving him trouble. What is it? Fili nervously tugged at a moustache braid. Frerin told me something. Thorin sighed. Do I need to hit him? Fili scowled, very hard, repeatedly. Frerin and his nephews were having a disagreement. Frerin had tried to convince Fili and Kili to call him uncle, as they sometimes did Thorin, but they constantly forgot. As Kili had complained, I can't call a Dwarro 30 years younger than me uncle. It just feels wrong. Frerin would not desist, however, and his nephews were treated to all the delights of his younger brother's most annoying habit, nagging. Needless to say, they were quickly growing irritated. Thorin had a wager running with Groin that Kili would land the first blow. Really? Thorin fixed Fili with a stern look that he knew well, and the younger dwarf shuffled his feet. Well, possibly. Is he always this annoying? Worse than Kili at 25, Thorin offered, and Fili shuddered. That can't be possible. All that aside, what did he tell you? Thorin wiped off his hands and then leaned against the workbench. He said... Fili hesitated and then burst. He said you can talk to them, that sometimes they hear you, in the sleeping thoughts beneath the waking ones. Thorin froze and then put down the cloth slowly. Yes, he said. Yes, Mahal granted me a boon. Why you? Fili cried. Why you and not me or Kili? Crossing to his nephew, Thorin took his shoulders. Fili clutched at him, and Thorin could feel him trembling. Is this about your Ahmad? Thorin said quietly. She cries and cries, Fili said, his voice tense and dark. When she isn't crying, she is nothing but a shell, a statue. She is so very alone, Thorin, and I hate it. I do too. Thorin tucked Fili's head beneath his chin. I have tried, nephew. She heard me a little at first, in the freshest storm of her grief. Now she is stone and hears nothing but her own loneliness. Does nothing help? Fili said, sounding very small. Thorin stroked Fili's thick yellow hair. Nothing that I have found. Why did Mahal give you this gift? Fili said. A gift that doesn't even work. I think perhaps it is because I shouted at him, Thorin said thoughtfully. A short bark of laughter escaped Fili. You yelled at our maker, he said, and shook his head against Thorin's shoulder. You're unbelievable sometime. A wry smile pulled at his lips. So I've been reliably told. Anyway, I shouted at him, and he said that for the injustice of our deaths, and the love he bore me, he would give me a way to reach them to make my amends. It is uncertain and inconstant, but he cannot pierce the walls of death further. Some hear me better than others. I believe it is because they know themselves well and are at peace with their own hearts. Fili said, and pulled back to frown up at his uncle. Who hears you? Dane does, now and then. Occasionally Balin, Dorian, Gloin as well, and Dwalin quite frequently. And Gimli most of all. Gimli? Fili's mouth dropped open. Our little cousin, Gimli. He's not so little any more, Thorin said, raising his eyebrows. The lad has more beard than Bofur, is broader than Nori, and is most certainly taller than you, though not as cool as Kili. I judge he's over 4'6" and has further still to grow. I know, but he'll always be little Gimli with a terrible temper to me, Fili said, shaking his head. Gimli hears you. Well, that is a shock. Then Fili's eyes lit up. Oh! I know that look, Thorin said suspiciously. That is not a reassuring look. Gimli is still in Ered Luin, yes? Fili grabbed at Thorin's tunic in his excitement. Where Mum is! You can get him to comfort her. They're cousins. He knew us and she wouldn't be so alone. I'm sure it would help. Oh, talk to him. Please, please try. I will not get him to do anything, Thorin snapped and shook Fili off. I am done with leadership and command, Fili. I have proven to be unworthy of it. Besides, I will not influence the lad to do anything that he would not normally do. That would be the basest form of coercion. Such things are a great evil. Gimli would help her if he knew, Fili pleaded. He was practically trembling with desperation and his breath was coming quite fast. I'm dead, you're dead, Key's dead, we're all dead. I can't be there for her and neither can you, but someone has to. Gimli is there and as distant as the connection is, he is still a Durin, still family. The only family she has left in Ered Luin. He was our friend. He called her aunt. They're both alone, and you could fix that. Remind him of her, that's all. He'll do the rest, I know he will. Help her, help them. Just try. If not for me, then for Mum. Please? Their eyes met. Thorin dropped his head. For the love I bear you, and the woe the shadow wrought in you, he murmured, and sighed deeply. Of course he would do as Fili asked. He owed the lad everything and more, after all that he had stolen from him. Oh, I've just got to pause there for a second, because that is one of my favourite lines in this fic at all, is for the love I bear you and the woe the shadow wrought in you. Is just so good. I love it. Anyway, carrying on. You'll do it. Fili leaned forward, hope shining in his face. Thorin rubbed at his face with nerveless fingers. Yes, he said, and then he reached out and gently tucked one of Fili's braids behind his ear. Yes, I'll try. For you and your brother, and for Dís. Fili whooped and raced to the door, his boots ringing against the stone. I'll get Key. Don't go into the starlight without us. We're coming too. Thorin watched him go with a sinking feeling and wondered what exactly he had let himself in for now. Fili returned in only minutes, Kili skittering behind him. Their faces were alight with hope, and Kili immediately blurted, Is it true? They can hear you? Thorin ran a hand through his hair. It's true, but... Kili let out a hoot of joy and punched the air in triumph. But, Thorin repeated, they cannot hear my words directly. The mists that divide Arda from Aman cannot be so easily pierced. They only hear me in their subconscious mind, and even then many do not perceive me at all. But some do, Kili said. Some, Thorin agreed, his expression guarded. Gimli hears him, Fili interrupted breathlessly, and Gimli is in Ered Luin. What are we waiting for? Kili let out another delighted whoop and grabbed Thorin's wrist. Let's go, let's go, let's go! Thorin pulled backwards, his greater weight keeping him immobile against Kili's enthusiastic towing. My forge. We'll still be here when we come back, Fili said with a lilt of impatience. The fires are not lit and the knife doesn't have legs. You promised, Thorin. Thorin debated with himself the wisdom of pointing out that really he hadn't promised, and then decided against it. He allowed himself to be dragged to the chamber of Sansûkh. Kili was biting his lips in excitement as he stared at the waters of Gimlîn-zâram, and Fili's face was pale but earnest. With another sigh, Thorin took their hands and allowed the starlight to claim him. When the light faded, they were looking at Dís. Kili's breath caught, and Fili's mouth tightened, but neither spoke. Nor did they have to. Dís's back was stiff, and her hands were still and white-knuckled as she sat motionless behind her jeweller's table. No gems or broken pieces lay before her, and she was staring at the rolls of felt that contained her tools with unfocused eyes. She just sits there, Thorin said dully. Sits and sits. Fili squeezed his hand. Let's find Gimli, Kili said, his voice unusually grim, and Thorin closed his eyes, willing the sight of his lost and shattered sister to vanish. Opening them, he found that he was looking at the young dwarf in question. He frowned slightly. He'd never been able to direct the waters of Gimlîn-zâram to show him particular dwarves before, and he glanced over at Kili, who looked equally perplexed. Maybe it's because there are three of us and we all wanted to see the same Dwarrow, he suggested. Fili shrugged. Perhaps. Gimli was in the middle of a practice duel. His opponent was an older dwarf of approximately Balin's age, whom Thorin vaguely recognised. Clever lad, the older dwarf puffed, but the old man here has a few tricks up his sleeve that you might not have seen. I look forward to them, Gimli retorted, and his axe blurred around him. He was truly skilled. the axe moving in the tight, whirling arcs that required coordination, finesse, and extreme muscular strength. Good, his opponent praised when Gimli blocked a savage underhanded swing and reversed it, immediately leaping to the attack. But do you know this one? His hands moved rapidly, the axe spinning for Gimli's neck. Ah, gnarly, Gimli growled, and brought the handle of his own weapon up before his face. The clash was deafening. You'll have to do better than that. Dwalin would have had me defeated and mopping out the barracks by now. Not enough of a challenge, Nidoy? Gnarly raised an eyebrow and laughed. Then he whistled sharply to the other students waiting on the benches that circled the training ring. Loney, come here. Let the both of us together teach our fine young warrior a lesson. Gimli stepped back, his eyes wary as he hefted his axe. Another young dwarf stood and moved onto the practice ring. He was heavier than their young kinsman, with a shock of thick brown hair on his head and a square-cut beard. He grinned. This time I'll finally beat you, Glóin's son, he said. Iron rivers will run backwards, and elves will live underground, and dwarves will roost in trees, Lane's son, Gimli retorted, rather rudely. Fili and Kili immediately broke out into snickers, and Thorin smiled despite himself. See what you mean about his temper, he murmured to Fili, who flashed him a quick smile. That idiot isn't going to beat him, Kili said, before peering back at Thorin. Is he? Thorin considered. Gimli was the better axeman, but Gnarly was more experienced, and the other youngster, Loney, had weight and reach on his side. I don't know. Let us see how he fares. Kili needn't have worried. Gimli scythed the axe towards their feet, and they were forced to jump awkwardly to avoid it. Gnarly stumbled, and Gimli was on him in a second, tapping the flat of his blade against his teacher's head. Dead, he said cheerfully. Aye, but so are you, Loney growled behind him, and Fili let out an involuntary cry as Loney's axe came spinning towards Gimli's head. The red-headed dwarf ducked and twirled, and his axe fairly danced as he slammed the butt directly into Loney's belly, forcing all the air from his young lungs. Yield, Gimli demanded, his blade held to Loney's throat. Loney nodded, his face sullen. That was well fought, Thorin said, as Gimli leaned his axe against a weapons rack. Then he walked over to a table where cloths were folded for the students, and bread and ale sat waiting for Gnarly. Then he took up a towel and began to wipe down his sweaty face. Very well thought. Frerin was not wrong about his talent. I wonder how he does with a sword, Fili said, tilting his head speculatively. I wish I'd... Look out! Filoni had pushed himself from the ground and launched himself towards Gimli's back, his axe held above his head to deliver a mighty strike. Sudûn! Thorin roared, forgetting himself in his outrage. Shekith! Gimli moved instantaneously. He picked up a couple of ale and span, throwing it full in Loney's face. As the other boys sputtered, Gimli lashed out with his fist and caught him square on the nose. Ikhuzh! Gnarly snarled, and Gimli froze, his hand drawn back for another blow. Gimli, Loney, what is the meaning of this? Loney, clutching his bloody nose, muttered, I wanted to finish the duel. The duel is finished. Gnarly stamped over and pulled at the young dwarf's ear. You yielded the match to Gimli and so lost the contest. To attack an unarmed dwarf with his back turned is a coward's move, and I taught you better than that. Lane will be hearing of this. Mark my words. Loney winced. Gimli folded his arms. And me? Gnarly glared at him. You could have disarmed him easily and let you chose to strike him. A just warrior does not toy with a weaker opponent simply to enjoy it. Neither does he indulge in petty revenge. Gimli's scowl was ferocious. Gimli, you will clean this mess you have made. Loney, and Gnarly shook the ear pinched between his fingers. You will be on a week of night watches, and I'll see all of you at dawn. A groan rose from the assembled ranks of students. The rest of you had these two to thank for our early start. Let that teach you to think before behaving so rashly in future. Am I understood? Both lads hung their heads. Yes, Gnarly. Then go to it, Gnarly said, and released Loney's ear to stalk out of the door. At sunrise, remember. The assembled youngsters moved out after him, and several dark glares were aimed at Gimli and Gnarly as they left. Gimli glared back before turning to his opponent, who still clutched his bloody nose. All right, sorry, he said ungraciously, and picked up another cloth. Here. Now don't tilt your head back. You'll swallow your own blood, and it'll make you ill. Lean forward, it will clot eventually. What in Mahal's name were you doing? Wanted to win for once. Loney grumbled, but he let Gimli press the cloth to his face. I have some skill, but no one can see it in the shadow of yours. You're an idiot, said Gimli bluntly. You're good, yes, but still an idiot. You're bigger than me, and you could have had me if you'd kept me at a distance. Look, why don't we practice together? I could use a taller opponent anyway. I want to surprise Dwalin when I see him next. Loney laughed sourly. I am no Dwalin. You'll be as tall as him, so I don't see why not, Gimli said, and shook his head. Idiot. Yes, I'm aware, Loney growled. I don't need you to keep pointing it out. Hold that to your nose. I have to clean up this ale. Gimli eyed the mess and grabbed another cloth before hunkering down on his knees and beginning to soak up the spilled ale. I'm not going to apologise for being good, he said as he scrubbed, blowing a lock of fiery hair out of his eyes. Neither am I going to feel sorry for a dwarf who tried to axe me in the back. But a training partner with more strength and reach than me? Now that is of interest. You can get the recognition you crave so badly when you knock me on my back fair and square. What do you say? Loney's eyes had lit up behind his bloody cloth. Aye, as you say, that is of interest, he replied. Then we have an agreement. Gimli sat up and threw the soaking cloth from the ring, taking another one. Ugh, I smell like a brewery and I haven't had a drop. This work makes a dwarf thirsty. If your nose is dried up, shall we go and share a cup at Borin's? I shouldn't, Loney said, and his shoulders slumped. I have night duty. Ah, yes. Another time, then. Go on, get washed up. We'll begin tomorrow. Is that to your liking? Loney nodded and then attempted to smile. Thank you, Gimli. I'm sorry. Aye, and so you should be, making me spill all this fine ale. Such a waste. Gimli laughed and waved as Loney left. Is old Borin's tavern still running, then? Keely wondered, and then quailed at Thorin's sudden dark look. Feely gave a weak little laugh and hushed Keely with a hand over his mouth. Just an academic interest, Thorin. Yes, never stepped foot in it ourselves, Keely said, muffled by Feely's palm. Or broke a table, or a lamp, or Borin's teeth. Lies and conjecture. Must have been 2 other dwarfs that looked like us. Yes, and with the same names. Impostors, no doubt. Thorin rolled his eyes to the ceiling and prayed for patience. Gimli kept scrubbing at the wet stones, his shoulders bunching. He stopped at one point to scratch at his short red beard before attacking the floor once more. Thorin stepped forward, seeing his chance. Gimli, he said, and stopped in cautious surprise as Gimli paused momentarily, his head cocking as though hearing something just out of earshot. Thorin looked back to Feely and Keely, who nodded eagerly. Gimli, he said again. Once more Gimli stopped. This time, however, the lad pushed up onto his knees and frowned. Is someone there? Barafoon, Thorin said, and crouched down before the young man. Your cousins are with you, Gimli, son of Gloin. Feely, Keely, and Thorin. We are here. Gimli blinked, and then he shook his head sharply. Surely I can't get drunk from a few fumes, he said to himself, and Keely snorted. You're not drunk, lad, Thorin said, and shook his own head in disbelief. We're here. Gimli squinted, peering straight past Thorin. Must be imagining things. I can't be drunk, and I do not think I am mad. Feely smacked his forehead with his palm. Thorin resisted the urge to do the same. Not mad either, cousin. Mahal grants us this, that we can see you from beyond the mists. To me he gave a greater gift. Some may hear me. I'm of Durin's line, Gimli continued, his brow creasing with worry. I could be mad. I'm too young for it, though. Steady, Feely said quietly, putting a hand on Thorin's shoulder as he shook with anger and shame. You are not mad, he said shortly, only very, very dense. Gimli's eyes narrowed and he began to look around the room. This is you, Loney, he snarled. Then I must say it's in very poor taste. Oh, for Durin's sake, Keely exclaimed. Not a prank either. Thorin pinched the bridge of his nose between his fingers and reined in his temper. I am Thorin, son of Thrain. I was killed 3 months ago and passed beyond the borders of Middle-earth. The halls of Mahal keep my sister sons and I until the world's ending. From this place we may see our friends and kin when we wish. And we are standing right before you, you young fool. Gimli sprang to his feet, the colour draining from his face. King Thorin, he breathed, and then he rubbed at his head. Why did I say that? Careful, uncle, Keely said in a tense undertone. He nodded, and then grasped his nephew's hands before bending all his concentration on the perplexed boy before them. Gimli, remember the Lady Dees. Remember the woman whom you called aunt and now sits alone. She lost more than you, kinsman. Remember the Lady Dees. He was her brother, Gimli whispered, and then he pulled at his vibrant hair. Oh, I am such a fool. Of course my conscience would not let me rest until I had seen her. I lost my cousins, but she lost all she had left in the world, not drunk, not mad, not tricked, but surely a blind and selfish fool. He thinks you're his conscience, said Feely blankly. Thorin looked at him helplessly. Gimli bit down on his lip, and then looked at his tunic and ale-stained trousers. "Can't be wearing these to visit a princess," he muttered, and gathering the wet cloths and his axe from the rack, he strode purposefully from the training room. Following him, the 3 dead Dwarrows were able to see just how empty Ered Luin had become. Gimli led them through familiar tunnels and corridors that had once bustled with activity. Now it seemed that Thorin's halls were slowly emptying once more. Only the young and the old seemed to be left. Gimli halted outside a set of apartments that Thorin recognised as Gloin's, and he pushed open the door. "Mother!" he yelled as he entered. "Gimrys! Where are you?" "Gimli!" hissed a feminine voice, and Gloin's wife Mizim thrust her head through a door. "What sort of racket do you call this, storming in here and shouting?" "That's Gloin's wife," said Keely, stunned. "Aye, Gloin's silver jewel. He told you she was a famous beauty, didn't he?" Thorin smiled. Mizim had broken many a heart before finally finding her one in Gloin. Even Thorin had wasted a few sighs over her. Her figure was still strong, sturdy and proud, and her eyes were still exquisite, though fine lines now traced the corners and white threaded through her pale hair and beard. "How's a boulder-faced shrub like Gloin end up with a Dwarrow dam like that?" Fili said, eyes wide. "He was kind, honest and respectful," Thorin said, and he made her laugh. Gimli batted away his mother's hands. "Not now, Ahmad. I need my good tunic. I need the golden hair clasp grandfather made me. Where do we keep them?" Gimli threw the sodden rags into the fire and began to rummage through the carven boxes and upon shelves. "Gimrys, can I borrow your comb?" He hollered as he continued to search. A young Dwarrodam of maybe 50 years stumbled into the room, rubbing at her eyes. Her hair was just as fiery as Gimli's, and her face was as lovely as her mother's, even though it creased in a scowl. Fili immediately fell silent, his jaw dropping open. "I'm in love," Keely declared fervently. "I saw her first," Fili snarled. Thorin gritted his teeth. "You are both dead." I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop. Every time I read it, that line gets me. Thorin's just so done with his nephews. He's like, fuck's sake. Carrying on. Keely gave him a wounded look. "That was uncalled for." "Brother," the lass growled, "I hope you have your axe on you, because after waking me you're going to need it." "Gimri's not now. The comb, please. I need it. I must look my best." "You smell like a tavern," Mizim said with a disdainful sniff. Gimli growled under his breath. "I have not had a single drink. I threw Gnarly's ale in the face of an idiot hothead. Oh, never mind. I'll find it all myself." "All right then, you ill-tempered bear. You can use my comb. What's the big occasion?" Gimli said. Gimli made a soft exclamation of satisfaction and brought out a soft blue formal tunic embroidered with gold and black thread. He looked up. "I must see the Lady Dees," he said seriously. "I have neglected a duty." Mizim's eyebrows drew together. "The Lady Dees does not wish to see anyone. And what duty?" "Well, not a duty then, but a kindness," he said, dragging off his tunic and struggling into the new one. It was slightly too small, but Gimli either did not care or notice. "I realise that we are her only family this side of the Misty Mountains, and it falls to us to comfort her. We lost our king and our princes, but she has lost her brother and her sons. With all else she has lost, it is no surprise she locks herself away except for the morning audiences. She is utterly alone, and I think I should see her. Fili and Keely were my friends, and they would want me to." "Told you," Fili murmured. Thorin grunted. Mizim looked uncertain, but Gimris's face cleared as understanding dawned. "Do you think I should come too?" she asked. "If you like," Gimli said, shrugging, "but perhaps one dwarf at a time. I would not wish for a crowd if I were her." "That's very thoughtful, Gimli," Mizim began, "but do you suppose she would even wish to see you? She has not spoken to you since you were quite young." "Aye, and I called her aunt, and she bounced me on her knee, I remember," Gimli said, and splashed water over his face. "If she does not wish to see me, then I will try again another time. But she has been left alone all this time, and so she must feel that she is alone. She should know that we think of her, and that she is still cared for as a dwarf, and not just as the regent of Thorin's hall. I am not her son or her brother, but I am family, and I care. And I love them too." In the silence that followed, the grip of Fili's and Keely's hands tightened on Thorin's to the point of pain. "Well, I'll go next time," Gimri said, and then tutted at her brother's wet and wild mane. You look ridiculous. Sit and I'll braid it for you. You look like a pony caught in the rain. Gimli's lips quirked, and then he looked up at his mother. I may not be home for dinner, he said. I suppose you must do as you feel you must, Mijim said, and then kissed Gimli's forehead before smoothing the tunic down over his shoulders. You're a good boy, my son. He squirmed away, batting at her with wet hands. Mum, I'm 63 soon. I'm not a boy. She snorted. You are such a boy, Gimli. I'll find your clasps. I hope you still fit your engraved boots. Come on, you haystack. Let's make you less hideous, Gimli said, brandishing her comb. Gimli gave her the fed-up look of an older sibling before sitting before his sister. She began to weave his hair into a long, thick plait that followed his spine. Great Mahal, Gimli, what are you keeping in here? It feels like a nest. I had practice, he said, scowling. You must have been fighting a thornbrush. And those trousers don't suit that tunic either. You won't be able to wear it much longer, you know. Your shoulders are about to come through the seams. Not my fault, Gimli said defensively. I grew too fast. You ate too much, you mean, she said, and he sent an elbow back into her stomach. I had to eat. I was growing. She pulled his hair sharply in retaliation. I'm sure. Wear the black trousers, the ones with the patterns sewn into the hems. Did you want to wear the steel ear cuffs? I should. They were a gift from cousin Balin, he said, and ran a curious hand over the top of his hair. She smacked his hand with the comb. Not till I'm done, she snapped. Keep your mitts off it. Gimli, you're a tyrant, he grumbled. Do you think I will still fit in that belt with the garnets? She snickered. Only if you wore it around your fat head. Hold still, stop wriggling. You're making it all crooked. Fili and Kili were snickering as well, and even Thorin could not help the small sound of amusement that escaped him at the sight of Gimli's thoroughly irritated face. With a loud sigh, Gimli subsided, his thumbs plucking at the ale-stained patches on his trousers. Mijim returned, her hands full, and together mother and daughter threaded a set of golden barrel clasps into Gimli's bright hair. Then Gimli struggled into a new pair of black trousers, also slightly too small, and took out his plain and serviceable ear cuffs, and replaced them with a set which Thorin recognised as Balin's familiar work. A pair of warm, fur-covered boots with engraved toe guards followed, and the belt was found and promptly rejected. Will I serve? Gimli said, holding out his arms. Mijim smiled at him and threaded 2 golden beads onto the short tufting braids of his beard. You look very handsome, she told him. For a troll, Gimli added cheerfully. Gimli, Mijim snapped. Her daughter rolled her eyes. Fine, sorry. You look nice, big brother. Then she punched him lightly in the arm. Seems you're not a complete waste of space. You're doing a good thing. I get to wear the gold clasp next time, all right? Only if I get to braid your hair, Gimli said, a wicked glint in his eye. Mijim gave the long-suffering sigh of all parents. Get moving before you grow out of your clothes altogether, she said. I'll leave bread and cheese out for you in case you come home late and haven't eaten all right. Bread and cheese? Gimli said plaintively, and then straightened at Gimli's amused look. I mean, thank you, Mum. Thank you both. With that, he was moving, striding purposefully from the family's apartment and making his way through the city to the lowest levels. He did not falter. Where are we? Thorin hissed, following closely behind. I do not recognise this part of the halls. Don't tell me you're lost, said Kili. Fili hid a smile behind his hand. The iron mines begin just to our left, and the audience chambers are coming up ahead. Our old rooms are not far, but these passages weren't really used by any except the miners. Gimli must have done some work here. Mining? Thorin frowned. His father's a lord. He does not need to mine for a living. Thorin, everyone worked, even you. You took on blacksmithing. I was a jeweller like Mum, and Kili was a bowyer. No doubt Oin took Gimli into the mines. I know he still treats the miners now and then for their injuries. Thorin abruptly recalled that Oin had originally damaged his hearing in a mining explosion. Ah, but a miner? He does not seem to have the patience for iron excavation and refinement. He wanted to be a surveyor or a stonemason when we were little, Kili said. He likes caves and rocks. He would be in raptures over the chamber of Sansûkh, Fili agreed. That was unusual. He does not have a craft, then. Time enough to choose a calling when I am old and can no longer swing an axe, Gimli murmured, startling them all. There is so much to learn about the world. Why would I limit myself before I found that which makes me happiest? Shh, Kili hissed. Durin's beard, he senses you so clearly, Fili said, and ran a hand through his hair. I never would have believed if I hadn't seen it. The corridors became familiar again, and a fluttering sense of apprehension began to claw at Thorin's belly. Gimli stopped at a painfully well-known door and pulled the new tunic straight before taking a deep breath. "Here we go," he said to himself and knocked. It opened, and a dwarf with the crossed axes of a guard upon his back peered out at Gimli. "Yes?" he grunted. "Gimli, son of Gloin," Gimli said with a polite bow. "I'm here to see the Lady Dees, if she will." "The lady sees no one," the dwarf said shortly, and began to close the door. It stopped on Gimli's heavily engraved boot, and the younger dwarf gave the guard a pleasant smile. "Announce me," he suggested. "Perhaps you will make an exception." "You deaf boy! The lady sees no one," the guard said with impatience, and kicked Gimli's foot away. "Perhaps I should make myself clearer," Gimli said, still smiling. "Gimli, of the line of Durin, here to see his cousin, if she will." The guard's sneer dropped like a stone. "I'll announce you." "You do that." "All right," Thorin said. "Now I believe the boy is related to me." Keely's laugh was a little high and shrill. Gimli waited, his fingers fidgeting over the embroidery at the edge of the too small tunic. Wisps of his short, thick beard were already beginning to escape the gold beads, and he chewed on his lower lip absently. The guard returned with a perplexed look on his face, and he eyed Gimli with suspicion. "She'll see you," he said, "but don't expect her to be pleasant." "Don't expect her to be anything other than as she is," said Gimli with an admirable calmness. "What's your name?" The dwarf raised an eyebrow. "Ankar, son of Borchar." "Thank you, Ankar." The guard's other eyebrow rose. "You're welcome, boy." "Kind when he wishes to be," Thorin murmured, remembering Freyren's words. "Aye, and forgiving." Ankar led Gimli to a room beside the audience chamber and opened the door. "Gimli, son of Groin, lady," he said respectfully, and nodded to the lad to enter. "Actually, it's Gloin," murmured Gimli. "Groin was my grandfather." "I know who you are, child," came a voice. "Come in." To the 3 children of Thrain, they had said, Mahal gave one a voice of golden thunder, one a voice of silver bells, but the third had a voice of mithril and diamonds, more lovely than the voices of elves, and as pure as the snow melt from the peak of the mountain. Deese's beautiful voice was dead. She sounded lifeless and hollow, her voice a dull echo of what it had once been. Gimli entered with a glance to the guard, and Ankar nodded to him once before closing the door. Deese was seated before a fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. She did not look up as the door clicked closed behind the guard. There was an uncomfortable silence, and Gimli walked further into the room, his dark eyes wide. "Hello, Aunt Deese," he said eventually. "It has been a long time since you called me that, son of Gloin," rasped Deese. "True," Gimli said. "I won't fit on your knee any more." She smiled, but there was no warmth to it. "Indeed, you're no longer a child. Why are you here?" Gimli blinked, and then he looked down at his hands. "You're not my aunt," he said slowly. "You're my cousin, and we lost some of our family. There's just me and Gimri and you, because everyone else is dead." Deese croaked, and finally looked up from the fire. "Everyone is dead, my whole family, but for cousins like you. My sons, my last brother, my father, we were so proud, so strong. Well, Mahal has punished us for our pride, at least." "No," Gimli blurted, and he took another couple of quick steps towards her. "Not everyone is dead." "You?" Deese laughed. It was utterly unbearable to hear. "Your sister, Balin, Dwalin, your father and uncle? You're not my family. We are relatives, no more than that. No, my family is dead and gone. The line of Thror is ended." "They're not all dead," Gimli repeated, and he lifted his eyes to hers. "There's you." She froze, and then sagged. "Me?" "That's why I'm here," Gimli said, and took one more step, "because there's you. You're not my mother or father or uncle or sister. We're not close, but you're my family, and I once called you my aunt. I would call you aunt again if you would let me." Fili took a sharp, short breath. "Careful, cousin," he breathed. "Is this pity?" Deese stood, and her hair tumbled down around her shoulders. She looked like a wild woman, her dark eyes red and hard. "Pity for an old woman left alone? You can keep it!" "Not pity," Gimli said defiantly, standing his ground. I would not dare pity you, lady. Then what? He hesitated and then blurted, I don't know. It is hard to put into words. The others in my training classes, they do not even speak of them. But they were my friends, my cousins, and I miss them. I wish I had gone with them. I wish my father had let me. I'm just a remote cousin, not a prince, not a warrior. I'm not important, but I have some skill. I could have done something. They should have lived. They should have lived to see their home restored. Dee stared at him for a long moment, her face draining of all colour as she took in his red cheeks and raised chin, his balled fists, and the angry tremor in his voice. Then she staggered backwards and collapsed back into her chair. Mother! Keely cried, and turned to Thorin. Help her! Wait, Feely had said harshly. Wait! Gimli acted immediately. He rushed forward and poured a cup of water from the jug upon a side table, and knelt before her, holding it up. Lady Dees, he said, his voice more gentle than Thorin could ever have imagined coming from the mouth of this brash young dwarf. I am sorry. Here. She took the cup with trembling fingers. You mourn them, she said faintly. You mourn them. Not your princes, your friends. Aye, Gimli said, and lowered his eyes. My cousins. And, despite what you say, my family. Keely pulled your hair, she whispered. Feely hid your toys. And I kicked his shins for it too, Gimli said, and smiled at his feet. I miss them. Feely hid my toys, but he showed me his new swords when he had finished his training, and taught me how to use the throwing axe, and how to spot the flaws in a gem, and all the different ways to knot rope. Keely pulled my hair, but he also gave me his old drafting tools when he had finished with them, and showed me how to play the fiddle and how to carve and string a bow. They were the ones who first took me drinking, and it was Feely who guided my steps, and Keely who held my hair back when I became sick. They look after me. I was only their loud young cousin, scurrying at their heels, but they looked after me. I looked up to them. They were fond of you, she said thickly. Gimli lifted his head, and their eyes met, 2 pairs of dark eyes, the eyes of Thrain, the dark eyes passed down from Nain the Second, last king of khazâd-dûm. Keely's eyes. Your brother made me my very first axe for my 50th naming day, Gimli remembered, and Dees huffed. Plain as plain, no doubt. Not a single decoration on haft or blade, Gimli agreed, but perfectly balanced. Thank you, Thorin managed through a throat blocked with his heart. He never had much patience, she said, her eyes growing distant. He could wait a century for a sign, but hated spending the time to put more than 3 braids in his hair. Gimli snorted. Oh, Keely's hair. To Thorin's amazement, she laughed, rusty and unused, but a true laugh. Keely's damned hair. I used to struggle with him every morning to at least get most of it out of his eyes. Mahal only knows how he ever aimed at a target through that curtain. Feel I should be offended, Keely said. Feely gave him a sad half-grin. The truth offends no one but you, brother. Don't look at me, Thorin added. I remember the fits you had when your mother brought you out a comb. I miss them, Gimli said again, and sighed heavily. No one understands why I am so angry, or why I train every day until I am exhausted. I struck another in the nose today, and I should know better, even if he does not. I have not been to the mines in weeks. I sat at the table in Borin's where Keely and Feely used to drink with me. The jokes are still carved into the wood, and Borin's teeth are still missing. I feel as though I could reach out and touch them. So close was that presence. But they were gone, and I am here, and it should not be this way. You felt a presence, Keely said, and blinked. Did you go to Borin's with Gimli? Feely hissed, and Thorin plastered a look of innocence on his face. Apparently it wasn't terribly convincing, because Feely snorted. You old hypocrite. I forgot that there were others who knew us. Dee said wonderingly, her fingers clutching her cup. Not as heirs of Durin's line, but as Feely and Keely, sons of Vili and Dees. Feely and Keely, my cousins and friends, Gimli said in a low voice. I should have been there. I would not have used your life to buy theirs, she said, and her other hand reached out and touched Gimli's thick red hair. Don't be so hasty to throw it away, Nidoyith. He smiled ruefully. I'm not really. But what is a miner, a banker's son, compared to a prince? What is my life compared to what theirs has brought? A miner, a banker's son, she said, can have a great heart. A miner and banker's son will go on to do great things, Gimli, son of Gloin. She set down the cup of water and took Gimli's hands. I would like it if you called me aunt again, she said softly. Gimli said nothing, but his hands tightened on hers. She leaned forward until her brow briefly rested on his, and then she pulled back. Will you tell me more? Gladly. Gimli settled at her feet and launched into a tale of 3 dwarflings and a hammer borrowed from Dwarling. Dys listened closely and laughed at the terrible predicament the 3 found themselves in, at the clever plots put into practice that only compounded the problem tenfold, at Dwalin's outrage when the hammer was finally recovered and the terrible injustice of the punishment, polishing every weapon he owned until it gleamed. Her eyes were glossy, but she no longer wept. Her hand remained on Gimli's vibrant hair, and every now and then she stroked it absently. Finally, Gimli finished and looked up at her. Aunt Dys. Gimli said she would come with me next time. Would you like that? She blinked as though coming awake, and then she smiled. It was still tinged with her fathomless sorrow, but she was no longer looked or sounded more the dead than alive. That would be lovely. How old is your sister now? 54, Gimli said with a shudder. Ah, the 50s. I feel for your poor mother, with 2 dwarrows under the age of 70 in her home. I am very mature, Gimli protested, and Dys laughed softly. Indeed you are. Bring Gimris, and I will tell you of the time my brothers and I stole Dwalin's favourite toy, Oliphant. Gimli choked on his breath, and then laughed loudly and merrily. Aye, that sounds like a tale not to be missed. She stood, bringing him to his feet, and then touched the seams that strained over his shoulders. You have grown out of this tunic. Perhaps Feli's... She stopped short on her son's name and then closed her eyes, her lips tightening. Give him mine, Dys, Thorin said suddenly. Keep your children's fine things and the memories they hold. He'll be as broad as me. Give him my feast day tunic. I never wore the thing anyway. She frowned. Both Fili and Kili turned to Thorin, their eyebrows high and their mouths open in surprise. Aunt Dys? Gimli ventured. My apologies, Akhûnîth, she said, opening her eyes and squeezing his shoulder. I was lost in thought. My brother's things still gather dust and moths, and you'll be of a size across the shoulders in a few years. You should have them. No, he protested. I cannot wear the clothes of a king. It would be... But you could wear the clothes of a cousin, she said, and squeezed his shoulder again. I will have them sent to you. No, don't refuse. He would be glad to be rid of them. Thorin hated formality. Too many painful memories. He'd much rather wear his armour and spit in the eye of public opinion. Gimli closed his mouth. If you say so, he said dubiously, then I will take them with thanks. My mother is tearing her hair out trying to keep me decent lately. She tugged a braid at his chin, just as she used to do with Fili's moustache. I know the feeling. Kili used to grow out of a tunic as I watched. It nearly drove me to drink. Gimli winced, and Fili rubbed at his mouth. I know that feeling, he said in sympathy. Ouch. I should go, Gimli said reluctantly. It's late. He made to bow, but she stopped him by pulling him into an embrace. Until next time, Gimli. Sorry. He stiffened for a moment in shock before hugging her tightly. Soon. The day after tomorrow, I have practice in the afternoon, but... I look forward to it, she said, and drew back to lightly touch his Durin brow. Go, your mother will be worried. He nodded and made to leave. Dys stopped him at the door by calling his name. I, he said, turning back around. Thank you, she said quietly. Your used name fits you well. He gawped, forgetting himself for yet another moment, before he grinned broadly at her and left. Thorin watched his sister sink back down into her chair. She rubbed her face with her hands and sat motionless for a few moments. Fili and Kili pressed closely to his sides as they stood, not 3 feet away from her, and yet as unreachable as Erendiel's star. She let out a long, shuddering breath, and then she gripped her knees tightly with her hands. Well, brother mine, she said to herself, let's see what you have stored away then. That's the end of chapter 3. Oh, my voice is like, I'm just going to have a drink. So I hope people are liking how I read this. I'm stumbling over some words and trying to slow myself down because I read and talk really fast. But yeah, I'm hoping people are liking how it's going. Let me know. I will, as always, put all the translations for the Khuzdul and anything else, any explanations that are on AO3 for the fic will then be in the description of the video. Or if you're listening to this on SoundCloud, hey, they'll be in the description of the recording. All right, bye, till next time.